Well, welcome everybody to another podcast episode from Kingdom Story, where we talk about all things discipleship. Today, I have a very good friend with me that I'll be talking with today. Her name is Rachael Lenoir, and we have been friends now for the last 8 years. We met each other actually through Kingdom Story all those years ago as we ventured to take the Kingdom Story experience and the Bible study together and serving and all sorts of different things. It's been a long journey and many things over the years. But today we come together to talk about something pretty pivotal, I think, in the church today, in our world today, and as much as it relates to discipleship. And today we're gonna talk about trauma and discipleship. And so, for those that are listening, just heads up, that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I think we'll be sharing a little bit from our own stories. So just really trying to understand trauma, the effects of trauma, and how trauma and discipleship affect one another, and how the church might be able to approach that. And so, Rachael, it's good to be here with you. I'm glad to have you here today.
I am so excited to be here with you, Brandon. You told me as I was coming in that we've known each other almost 10 years, and I immediately felt old.
Absolutely. Yeah, lots of years of experience behind that. So it's good to be here. Well, Rachael, nobody's, or at least on our side, has heard, any of your story or kind of where you're coming from. And so it'd be great if you just shared with us a little bit about your story and what's led you to have kind of, trauma and discipleship be something that's kind of a core of your calling and something that you're very passionate about. So I think people would like to hear about that.
Yeah. So I grew up in a family on both generations that were deeply rooted in Christ and the church and missions and all of these things. And so I grew up in the church knowing Jesus and all of these things, but I also grew up with a lot of trauma. I grew up in a very abusive home. I experienced sexual abuse at the hands of my father, and sexual assaults and physical abuse, verbal abuse, spiritual abuse, neglect, and all of these different traumas that I experienced as a child. And so there were these two sort of parallel experiences I was having. There was this love for Jesus that I had that this was so deep. Even when I was a child, I just loved Jesus. And I wanted to please Jesus. And I wanted to be at church and be involved. And I think from a really young age, I felt a calling on my life to serve Jesus in some capacity, like in the church. But also to be experiencing this trauma and to see my father be a missions director at our church, and for my parents to be so heavily invested in church and to be in a home that was abusive. And so my growing up experience was confusing, to say the least. And I could see, like, as I look back, God really moving and working in my life and protecting me from a lot of what had happened to me. But ultimately, whenever I was able to leave my home and get to a safe space, I began to process this trauma for the first time in my life, to be able to say out loud, my dad did this to me, and what that meant, and that's not okay, and that's wrong. And then it's been ever since then this, I think 14 years now, 14-year journey of going to counseling and of healing from this thing called trauma. Mm-hmm. And in my journey of healing from trauma, there has still very much been a love for Jesus, but also I have seen and how trauma has devastated in my own life, my own ability to trust in God, to trust others, really to even be able to trust myself that I am capable, I am competent. And so this journey over the last 14 years of what it looks like to not just to heal from the trauma, but to walk with Jesus as I'm healing from trauma. And then to take that further, to walk with Jesus in the context of the church and to heal from trauma. Because I think a lot of what can happen is we can want to heal in isolation. And I know for me, that's what I did. I left the church for many years because I was so terrified of my own doubt. And that's that. I think that a lot of people struggle with that, even within the church, their doubt that God is good or that he cares or he's kind. And so this wrestling and this healing journey has been really hard, really painful. And it has been so good. And I have learned so much about myself through this process. And it was probably about 4 years ago when I began to really explore the question of, okay, I've healed from trauma. I'm healing, still healing, but I've seen significant healing in my life and growth and change. I want to help other people do that. And I could totally become a counselor and go that route. But what would it look like as someone who is very, very much called to pastoral care? I mean, and I've had this calling since I was really young. What does it look like to walk with people through trauma within the church? And so I became obsessed basically with this question. How do you do this? What does this look like? How can you do this in a healthy way? Because I have been doing this work, the discipleship, for 16 years. And I know a lot of what not to do from that experience. But
can I get an amen?
Yes, right? But what does it look like? What does it look like to do this well? And to not just be looking at discipleship on a one-on-one, like one person at a time, but what does it look like for a whole body, a whole church to heal together in community? Yeah. So that is really what has been, what I believe will be my life's calling, is to explore this question with myself really as the case study for what that looks like, and then to also move forward. And I'm going to get my master's degree in counseling and psychology and all those things. So yeah, that's really why I'm here and what I'm fascinated in.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And there's so much that you touched on there that I hope validated a lot of those that are listening to this, those that have been hurt by leaders in the church, significantly hurt, ranging the gamut in that, those that have had to wrestle with coming to church, and it's supposed to be a place that you can find healing, but sometimes it's not always equipped to do that. Yeah. And so we do it in isolation. Sometimes it causes more harm than good, and I think we'll get into a little bit of that later. You're also your walk with Jesus, and just, it's not always up and to the right, it's a curly Q journey, or, 8 steps back and only 2 steps forward as you're peeling back the layers of your own healing, and then having to trust Jesus more, and then peel back more layers and trust Jesus more.
And then being called to walk with people through their stuff as I'm on this crazy curly Q journey of my own. Right. And what does that look like to be a wounded healer?
Yeah, that's good. That's so good. Well, and the need for it, I think, both you and I are on staff at New Life Foursquare Church. And so we pastor there together under John Erickson, right? And I work here at Kingdom Story, but I'm working with pastors in Latin America and, and Europe. And everybody's struggling with their congregations who have hurt, who have trauma of some sort. and no answers. But sometimes they'll have a healing and freedom prayer night, which is great.
Right.
And sometimes it works, but not all the time.
Yeah.
And then what do we do when it doesn't?
Yeah.
And so I think your passion for this, and we were talking a little bit earlier before the podcast started about you wanting to just train leaders in how to be trauma informed as it comes to this. And we'll get into some statistics that you have about. They're overwhelming people. We'll hear that. It's crazy, and you'll be blown away about this. But let's start with just some fundamentals. Like trauma is a buzzword now. I mean, it's being heard everywhere.
Yeah.
And I want to caution people, on it, because there are those that are very hurt by this, and there are others that I think use the word and it may not necessarily apply to them.
Right.
We can't be taking away from those that actually, have experienced trauma. And it is, if I remember correctly, it is there is a continuum or a sliding scale, that it works on. So I wanted you to explain, what is trauma? As you would define trauma for us, how would you help those that are listening come to the understanding of what is trauma?
So trauma is extremely complex and often misunderstood. And like you said, it's become a big buzzword. And usually I sort of hear it within the context of, oh my gosh, I was talking to this cashier and they just got really out of control and they were really angry and it was so traumatizing,
Right.
And so in a sense, really what is happening though is that if we're not careful, we can really trivialize what trauma actually is. And so I do think it's important that we know our terms and that we define it correctly. So trauma is a lasting emotional response resulting from an extremely distressing event. And the key word there is lasting emotional response. And so this distressing event, or what we would also call a traumatic event, it can take place in childhood or in adulthood. Usually it's in childhood, but we do see traumatic events happening in adulthood. And it is considered to be like an isolated one-time occurrence. So examples of this are experiencing a really bad car crash, being a victim of violent assault, the death of a loved one, or living through something like a natural disaster, like Katrina. That was considered a very traumatic event. And so these traumatic events have the potential to significantly impact a person's brain and body, and it affects their ability to cope and to thrive, really. And unfortunately, this type of trauma isn't rare. So it's actually estimated, and when I saw this, I was blown away. It's estimated that at least 70% of adults have experienced some type of traumatic event at least once in their lives. And more than 2/3 of children, so 2 out of every 3 children, report experiencing a traumatic event before the age of 16.
Wow.
So for most, then, the traumatic events, they occur in childhood. And really what this means then is 70% of our congregations, including our children, have experienced trauma. And that is mind-blowing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just hear that number, people, 70%. And you might be thinking, well, I know I've experienced trauma, but you look out, you're like, nobody else has experienced trauma too. No, 70% have experienced trauma. 2 out of every 3 the children that we have. And I think it might even be getting worse as our world is evolving.
And this is actually an underestimate here because this is reported. There is so much trauma that isn't actually reported. So I think that the statistics may actually be much higher, especially when you consider the church to be a place where people will, like, hurting people come.
Right.
Broken people come. And so it is very, very rare for me to be in a church context where I can even run into one person who has never experienced trauma. It's actually incredibly rare.
Yeah, when you put it that way, I'm not sure I've ever experienced somebody who hasn't experienced that. So you mentioned that trauma is a lasting response from a traumatic event that is an isolated one-time occurrence. So what about things that are repeated, like ongoing, sexual assault or physical assault or emotional abuse for years? Are those considered to be traumatic events? How do we categorize things like that?
Yeah. So when trauma is a long-term chronic pattern, this leads to what is termed complex trauma. So I would actually say that for myself, I would fall into the category of, I would be diagnosed with complex trauma. I have been diagnosed with complex trauma. And I have also experienced incredibly traumatic events. Like I have survived many tornadoes where my entire town was destroyed in those tornadoes. So those were traumatic events. But complex trauma is a long-term chronic pattern. And so this usually stems from experiences in childhood, though it can also develop in adulthood with things like sex trafficking as an adult and those kinds of things. But complex trauma can arise in any situation where there's an ongoing sense of fear, horror, helplessness, or powerlessness for an extended period of time. So we're talking months or years, with the perceived or actual inability to escape. And so even if a child technically could just walk out of their home and escape this abuse, the child does not believe they can escape. Where would the child go? What would they do? You just see what I'm saying? So it's either an actual inability to escape or perceived inability to escape. And it can result from like various situations, ongoing abuse, like sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, like I said, human trafficking, surviving genocide, living in a war zone, living in communities where you see violence on a regular basis, day in and day out. People are getting shot. You're losing family members. This is complex trauma. So it's important to remember, though, and I just want to remind everyone, when we use the word trauma, it isn't describing a stressful encounter. It's or something unexpected that we go through that's hard as an adult. Because unless it's a situation as an adult where we actually cannot escape, such as being a prisoner of war, being on a battlefield every single day where we're being shot at, those types of situations. What happens when we become an adult is that we have learned coping mechanisms. So whenever I do go through something really stressful, such as the loss of a loved one, this is really hard and it is really sad, but it is not something that I will get trapped in, usually as an adult. So I think that that's really important. Just because we've been through something hard, it does not mean we're automatically traumatized. For something to be considered traumatizing, it has to have a lasting emotional response. From that event forward, somehow we have become stuck.
Yeah. Just hearing you talk about this again, it makes it very clear that we were not meant to live outside of Eden.
Yeah.
And now that we do live outside of Eden, it can be lurking around. Our brains just weren't meant to handle, that kind of stress, that kind of, input.
Yeah.
From whatever it is. And so that return to Eden, I think why we want and hope for it so much, in that, the release of this and not having to deal with these stressful situations anymore. Okay. So we've experienced a traumatic event, and such as, me losing, so I lost my dad when I was 15. Right? And, so what does it mean to have a lasting emotional response? How do you go from experiencing a traumatic event to being traumatized?
Okay. So for like your experience, like whenever you lost your dad at 15, this is something that is incredibly traumatic for a child to go through, because a parent is a source of stability and safety. And so when you go through this traumatic event, it activates this part of your brain that controls like the behavioral and emotional responses that we need to survive. And it's called the limbic system. And so when the limbic system is activated, it's like a fire alarm is pulled, and it shuts down your non-essential systems like rest and digestion and sleep. And it floods your body with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. So you can prepare to protect yourself by fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. You've heard those. Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn.
What is fawn?
Fawn, yeah. So fawn is actually something that it's sort of a newer response than the fight, flight, freeze. So fawn is a trauma response when if your trauma is being triggered, or you are in a very stressful situation, the way that you escape that situation is by doing whatever that person wants to do. So I'm so sorry. Don't be mad at me. What do you need? I'll do it. Whatever you want me to do. That is fawning.
Okay.
Sort of like deer in the headlight, like, I'll do whatever you want, just please don't hurt me. And so that is a very real trauma response as well.
Yeah.
And so you're flooded with all these hormones, and then once the danger passes and you're safe, your parasympathetic nervous system, it's this part of your brain that turns off that fire alarm. And so you've heard about the death of a loved one, and you go into gear. You've got to start planning the funeral. You've got to start making all these arrangements. All of these things need to be done. That is your limbic system working to make sure everything happens to like keep you safe. And so once all of that subsides and the funeral has happened and all of the arrangements have been made, your parasympathetic nervous system, it comes in and it sort of releases these chemicals that soothe and calm your body down. And so at this point, you can go back to your day with relatively few side effects, right? Perhaps only feeling a little jittery for a while or a bit on edge. But people who experience these traumatic events, who are impacted by trauma, this balance never really returns all the way. And so for some individuals, especially when they've experienced multiple traumatic events, one after another, or the ongoing trauma, complex trauma, your brain is like in a constant survival mode. And so then this response becomes this new normal, and it rewires the brain and traps trauma in the body. And so like that is the power of trauma. And it literally, that event that you experience as a child, that traumatic event, your body becomes trapped there at whatever age that was. And this is why we see things like adults having rage fits, throwing a huge tantrum, or going off in rage on people, right? And which is very similar to what a 4-year-old does when they're angry. And so these ways that we respond to trauma, we can actually get trapped in these events if we don't do the work of healing.
Yeah.
And so that's why we have to really, really pursue healing.
Yeah. Well, I think it even, it starts to put some flesh and some skin around, when the New Testament tells us to renew our minds.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, this is literal brain matter.
Yes.
And limbic functions that are getting hit here, and events that are changing and altering them. And so it's not just, we don't just snap our fingers and renew our mind, right? There's something has to get fixed. So when you, so what you're talking with the brain continuing to fire, or it's perceiving that it's constantly still in danger, even though you may not be anymore. These, I mean, I can only imagine the stress response, for that, when things are fine, yet your body's on fire, like something's happening.
Right. You're always expecting something to happen.
And I almost think about somebody returning from war.
Yes. It's PTSD.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So you mentioned that just because you go through a traumatic event, it doesn't mean you're automatically traumatized. So what factors influence whether trauma becomes trapped? You said it can be trapped in the body, like with this trauma event can be trapped, and you get trapped at a young age, whenever it happens. So say a little more.
Yeah. So, this answer is really complex. What all of the factors that play into this. And I think we're actually the researchers on trauma theorists and researchers are coming up with they're finding in their research new factors all the time. So it is a growing list. I can give you some basic factors.
Okay.
So age is a significant factor. So the younger a person is when experiencing trauma, the more likely it is to rewire their brain. Because think about it, when you're little, your brain is still developing. It's not fully grown. And so if you have that traumatic experience at a young age and all those chemicals are flooding your brain and you experience this intense fear and instability and insecurity, that has the power to rewire your brain for the rest of your life to believe that you will now always be insecure and you will not be able to have stability. It is the fear of the hammer being dropped, right?
Right.
And so the age is a huge, huge thing. So additionally, the presence of safe and healthy attachment to caregivers is a huge factor in whether you become traumatized. So say you have this traumatic event as a child, and we'll just use you for example, Brandon.
Yeah.
You lost your dad, and which I'm sure was just this core person in your life. How old were you?
15.
15.
Yeah.
15. You lost him when you were 15. He's like this core person in your life. And so you lose him. And so a lot of factors are going to go into whether you get stuck at that age. And going through something as traumatic as losing a parent, I would say is almost impossible to not be traumatized on some level from something that traumatic for a child. And so what happens though, the way that trauma, how deeply it impacts you is the people that you have in your life as support. Do you have a mother, for example? Because if you're just raised by your single dad and now you have no parent to rely on, the impact is going to be really different, significantly different than if you have a mother who is stable, is there to support you, can walk you through all of the emotions that you're feeling. And so say you do have a mom that she can support you and she can be there, but she's struggling too. And she doesn't know how to process this trauma. And so then is she able to talk to you about what's going on in your heart, or do you feel alone with this?
Right. Well, and that's actually a lot of my story is there was a group around me that could come in and was caring for me and seeing to my needs, but nobody knew how to talk to it. Nobody knew how to talk my mom through the trauma of losing, her husband, and nobody knew how to talk to me, especially my mom, and so while she took very good care of me, she checked out for 2 years, while she dealt with her own grief, in that. And I have there's a lot I've had to heal from that particular event that, that have influenced the way that I dealt with people, that have influenced the type of man that I was, that influenced all of those things, and so, I mean, like you said, the depth of such an event and how many different places it could touch, even if some of these, factors are met partially.
Right. Yeah. So it's when your dad died, it's not like you were homeless.
Right.
You had a home, you had people who loved you and cared for you. And I think this is something that's really important. Just because a child experiences a traumatic event, that doesn't mean they'll be traumatized. What really characterizes whether they're going to be traumatized is whether they feel like they're alone. And I think that when you are having to hold something alone, that is deeply isolating and really rewires your brain, because our brains are wired. God made them for connection.
Right.
And so what trauma does is it comes in and it rewires for protection. I'm on my own now. I have to deal with life alone. There's no asking for help. There's no, I'm just going to have to figure it out. Kind of that pull myself up from the bootstraps kind of a mentality. A lot of people don't know that this is a trauma response. And so being able to have safe and healthy attachment to caregivers, but also to have that support as you're going through an event like that. The number and intensity of traumatic events that you experience is also a factor. And so, say you lose your father and then in 2 weeks, your house burns down. And then 3 weeks after that, you get in a horrible car accident. I mean, that is, there's no way you're coming out of that statistically without some sort of rewiring of your brain.
Right.
And so, and there's so many more factors. We could talk about a non-neurotypical brain, for myself, for example, I have ADHD, which is a non-neurotypical brain, and my brain processes the world around me differently. And they're actually doing studies now that are showing that people with non-neurotypical brains, like with autism and with ADHD, are actually more likely when they go through a traumatic event to become traumatized than a person with a neurotypical brain, which is fascinating.
Right.
But then you have to ask the question, then you start talking about generational trauma, or what they call transgenerational trauma, where they're learning that you can actually become traumatized in the womb. If your mother, while she was conceiving you, went through a traumatic event herself, if she did not want the baby, if she did not, all of these things, if she has high levels of cortisol running through her body and is in that fight, flight, freeze or fawn mode while she's pregnant, she can actually pass trauma on into her child. And so the baby, it can be born with PTSD, and they've never even seen the light of day.
Wow.
So it's really incredible. And like I said, the factors in how trauma gets trapped, it's just more. And we're just learning more and more about it all the time.
Yeah. So again, I've said it a few times through this. I just hope that people listening are validated by what they're hearing here and getting some language to put around their own realities in this. And I think for us as leaders, to recognize this in our own selves. I mean, I think many of us, we're in the positions we are because we've gone through a bit of healing. Some of us more than others. But to look out to, I mean, again, Jesus can heal these things in an instant, but that's not the normal way. I think that he does stuff. I think it is a process that we have to go through. It was a process that got us into this, place,
certainly.
And then a process that's going to need to get us out. And so let's talk about the long-term effects of trauma, right? So a person experiences a traumatic event, their brain never goes back to normal functioning because things have been rewired. They got stuck. They're in survival mode, hyper alert. They're trying to protect, right, themselves. And And that event is trapped in their body, in their brain. I mean, even if they've blacked that out from consciousness, their body and their soul still remembers it and is responding to that. So how does that play out in someone's everyday life?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, so trauma can manifest in, I mean, so many ways. I can't even, just mentioning them here, it would take an hour to really, and they're still learning more about how trauma impacts us. But so it affects a person's emotional and relational well-being. So unhealed childhood trauma can lead to trust issues and inability to ask for help, depression, codependency, extreme fear of rejection, and self-destructive behavior, among many, many other symptoms. It can alter a person's personality. I mean, they're learning that if you experienced a traumatic event and you become traumatized, who you were before that traumatic event can be almost impossible to return to that person, because an entire personality can change and shift. And whenever that changes, it makes it challenging to regulate our emotions to navigate healthy relationships. And so long after the traumatic event occurs, people with trauma, they can feel shame, helplessness, powerlessness, and really intense fear. And so trauma is like this absolutely devastating. And depending on the amount and intensity of the trauma experienced, it can impact every single aspect of a person's life. I know that in my own life, there came this point where I realized I don't think there's a single thing that hasn't been marred by trauma in my life. I don't have one thing in my life that trauma hasn't tried to suffocate out and did suffocate out for many years. And so I think that the lie can be that trauma, this thing is in our past, right? It's way back there. That was forever ago. That was a long time. That doesn't impact me. I'm over it. And when I hear people say that, I'm over it, I'm like, what does that mean? What do you mean you're over it? And I start talking to them. Have you ever, thought about talking about what's going on with you, or talking about what happened to you with someone that you trust? Oh, what's the point? I get that a lot. What's the point? Why bring all this stuff up? And I love it. As I was listening to Brene Brown recently, which I highly recommend that you read her work. I follow her very closely in the work that she does on shame and vulnerability. And she was saying she has the same experience. People are like, I don't want to go. I don't want to deal with my stuff. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to open up Pandora's box, right? Because once you open it, you can't shut it.
Right.
But the reality is, and this is what she said, I just loved it so much. She said, the question you have to ask yourself is, do you really think that box is outside of you? That it's like this external thing that you can just put in the basement that doesn't impact you at all? And she said that Pandora's box, we're living in it. We're trapped by it every moment of every day. And the only way we're going to heal, the only way we're going to be free, is by opening it.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Impactful.
And so it's crazy because imagine 70% of our congregations, at least, and I'm, like I said, I think it's more, they're suffering in shame and fear with all of this. And I know that this was my experience for many years, just struggling in secret, afraid to tell people how much I'm basically drowning. And And even while I'm in ministry and I'm doing all these things in church that I don't know who I am. I don't know if I believe in God. I don't know if all of these things, right? This is a very complicated and very real issue within the church that I don't believe is talked about really at all.
Right. As you're talking, I'm reminded of Genesis chapter 3. We talk about it as like this place of the introduction of sin, and which is true, and we place a lot on that. But if you look at the whole story through the eyes of a trauma response and what you're talking about here, they do something they're not supposed to, and I think the impact of that hits them, and the first thing they do is hide.
Yes.
Right?
Shame.
They cover themselves.
Instant.
And they run away from God. I was afraid of you, so I hid.
Yeah.
In the garden, and then pushing blame off instead of taking ownership for whatever they had ownership of.
Right. Yes, it's absolutely true, and I think that is so rampant within our congregations, is that I think on some level, like we discussed, most of us are experiencing this pain and this isolation and this fear. And yet we think we're struggling and suffering alone, and we run and we hide because we're so afraid that we're not going to be accepted, that we're going to be rejected. And I think I just really want to see this change.
Yeah.
I want to see the church transformed into a place where people, the moment they realize, oh, I need to start talking about all of this, that's not the day they leave the church.
Right. It's, every single person that I've discipled, one of the places I go is to start trying to, open up Pandora's box with them. And without a doubt, every single one of them feels like whatever their story is will be the one story that is going to turn me away.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
And I have yet, so and I tell them, I said, I've yet to find that person. And this is dealing with people in addiction recovery, those that have been in jail, all over the place. And I think God has equipped you and I, especially for this, but I think this is your heart that the church would be this way, because I don't think the church is that way.
Yeah. If you were to ask the average person, the non-believing person, hey, what do you think about the church? The response is guaranteed to not be good.
Right.
I don't believe that the church, by and large, is considered a safe place. And especially with all of this whole deconstruction movement,
right.
Where especially our generation, millennials, are leaving the church in droves to deconstruct their faith and to pick it apart, which I want to be clear, I am all for. I think that the deconstruction process, especially when it is the result of spiritual abuse and trauma, is so incredibly important, and that we need to be deconstructing our faith. The issue then comes in, though, that they never reconstruct. They pick it all apart, and what's left is ashes on the ground.
Right.
Just a mess. And then they say, you know what? Forget it. I don't want any of it. Yeah. And they walk away. Yeah. When really my heart is for the church to be the place where people feel safe to not only deconstruct, but to see their faith reconstructed and restored to wholeness.
Yeah. I think not only with deconstruction and our generation coming to some of these, deconstructing the current construct that's there, but in dealing, when I was working down at the rescue mission and dealing with guys who have been in jail or have suffered addiction.
Yeah.
So again, looking at the whole thing through the eyes of trauma.
Yeah.
Right. You might be angry at them or whatever, weirded out because they were in prison, but okay, now put them in prison and a constant stress reaction because you have no idea how people are going to treat you.
Yes.
You don't know how the guards are going to treat you. The person you have to become just to survive that. Now you come out and now you go through a healing process. or an addiction recovery, or dealing with addiction. You're out on the streets, and suffering that kind of, however that trauma manifests itself. But then these people get clean, they get sober, they're on a new path, and then they find their way into the church.
Yeah.
And one of the things of recovery is that you're 100% open and vulnerable, because it's the only way you're going to find recovery.
Right.
And everyone in the church goes, whoa, I don't want to hear your 100% vulnerability, because I'm only 20% vulnerable.
Yes. Yes.
And then they end up leaving because there's not a space for them. And we can't handle their 100% vulnerability, which it seems like a lot of what we're going to get into when trauma meets discipleship, but knowing these effects, these long-term effects, seeing things through the lens of trauma, the church doesn't seem to be well equipped to handle this, especially the way the world's going.
It's really not. And I mean, the Barna Group, which is like this research firm that specifically researches and gathers data about the church. And so they came back with a startling statistic that said that 70% of pastors, when asked across, like, this is trans-denominational, like, so we're talking Catholic, Protestant, everywhere in between, the Christian church in America, when asked if they feel equipped to deal with trauma and to minister to those who have been traumatized, 70% said, no, I do not. And which is astounding when you put that statistic together with the 70% of congregants who have experienced trauma, at least. And so we have a majority of pastors who don't know what to do with a majority of their congregation. And I don't say this to shame.
Right.
I say this to bring attention to a very real problem within the church. And I believe that, these pastors, the answer that they gave is they're afraid. Number one reason they don't feel equipped is they're afraid they're going to hurt people. They're afraid that, you have this person, like you said, Brandon, that comes in, off the streets from prison, is recovering from addiction, that, maybe they never went through that experience. I've never been in prison. I've never recovered from an addiction. Look, I don't have anything to give this person. I don't know what to say to them. I can't. I'm just going to make it worse. And so when the reality is that all Jesus ever asks us to do is to give them him.
Right. Right.
And so that, I think that we have a long way to go.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why we're having this discussion, is Kingdom Story Ventures to help people build a culture of discipleship. I think it takes a while for them to get it all the way. And I think this is part of it, right? It's not a program. It's not a book. It's not a 6-week study that does discipleship. I think if you're truly discipled, there's a courage in you. There's a trust that you have for you to enter into a situation such as what you just described, and to go, well, I've not experienced that, but Holy Spirit has. And so Holy Spirit can give me what I need to give you in this moment if I just love you. If I just commit to walking alongside you, in this. We'll figure this out. I don't have all the answers, but I trust that God brought you here for a reason. Yeah. So, all right, God, you do the heavy lifting.
Right? Yeah.
I think we'll explore a little bit of this. And so you're beginning, you at the heart of this, it's your passion, you want to educate the church to be trauma informed. And I agree with you. It's something that we most desperately need right now. So what I'm curious about, I think what those are curious about that are listening, is, what is discipleship to you? I know how we have our definition of it here at Kingdom Story, but what is discipleship to you personally? And how have you seen trauma impact the discipleship process?
Yeah.
That's a large question.
It is. It's a huge question. I love it. So I think it's so important to really define discipleship biblically, because I think a lot of Christians don't know that just because they're a Christian and you go to church on Sunday, it does not mean you're a disciple of Jesus.
Wait, what?
I know, right? It doesn't mean you're a disciple of Jesus. And I think when we hear the word discipleship, it can often be understood as I'm learning the basics of the Christian faith, right? So I'm reading my Bible and I'm learning how to pray. But discipleship in Scripture, it means so much more than just the transfer of information. So when you are a disciple in Jesus's times, it refers to imitating the teacher's life, like instilling his values as your own and reproducing his teaching. So you are trying to be like a carbon copy of the master or teacher that you're following. So for me, Christian discipleship is this really intentional process. And I love what you say, Brandon. I love how you say, you're always like, discipleship does not happen by osmosis. You don't just show up and, oh, I'm discipled. Like it's so true. It is an incredibly intentional process where we walk with a disciple maker, someone who is more mature in the faith than we are, who helps us cultivate our relationship with Jesus as we follow him. And so, and we are literally being transformed into the image of Jesus, and we are taking on his worldview. And so what's important to remember, though, is like I consider myself to be a disciple maker. That Jesus has called every single one of his followers to be disciple makers. But I am not the ultimate teacher, right?
Right.
Jesus is the master that we are transforming into. And so he is really the one that's discipling. I view myself as sort of this guide, this friend, a fellow traveler on the path to healing and transformation.
Like Paul saying, follow me as I follow Jesus.
Yes, right. Exactly. And so, so that's how I would define discipleship. It's intentional. It's this process that is one-on-one, or it was in a group context that is specifically geared towards transforming into the image of Jesus. Not just let's come together and eat dinner every other week, but we are here talking about, are we being transformed and really living that out in a real way?
Yeah.
And so I've been walking with others in the discipleship process for about 16 years now. And when I first started out, probably the first 10 years of that time, I put this huge emphasis on spiritual disciplines. I think like we all do. Honestly, I'm going to be honest. I think within the church, I think discipleship can kind of be understood as like, oh, you just need to learn to read your Bible and pray and serve like that. And here's the thing, like that's really important because, whenever you meet someone who's new to the faith and you're like, here's this Bible. And they're like, what do I do with this ginormous 10-pound book? They need to learn how to approach it.
Right.
They need to learn how to read it in a way that's going to be transforming for their lives. So those are huge parts of it. But the problem was that I think for myself, I began to, in my discipleship, spiritual maturity was linked to spiritual disciplines. So like if you do these things, if you read your Bible, if you pray, you do all these things, like you're doing it, right? Like you are following Jesus. Yes. You're serving regularly, you tithe. And so I would teach the people the Bible, teach them how to pray, all the basics of Christianity, but I was not seeing any growth. Like not any real transformation in their lives. And I'm not saying that scripture like doesn't have the power to transform. But it just felt like every single person that I was walking with was hitting a wall. And like they would like relapse into addiction. They could not process or like let go of their rage. They couldn't forgive people or weren't willing to. They'd disappear and stop meeting with me. They'd stop showing up at church. They seemed to be like stuck in these unhealthy patterns, stuck in their marriages, like struggling to trust God. They're easily triggered by seemingly like insignificant things, but these things would then send them into a spiral. and kind of upend their entire life, right? And so I'm dealing with all this, and I was just like beating my head against the wall. Like, what is happening? What am I doing wrong? And here's the real kicker, though. Behind the scenes in my own life, I was drowning. I was in counseling, grappling with my own past and my trauma. I was grieving. I was stuck. I was relapsing into addiction. I was struggling to trust in God. And if the key indicator, which I believe for discipleship, I believe the key indicator of if we're actually living out being a disciple of Jesus, I believe it is the fruit of the Spirit in our life. It is how we love people. It is how, are we kind? Are we gentle? Are we patient? Do we exhibit self-control? Do we love people? And that was not the marker of maturity for me, right? It was the what you do, right? The spiritual disciplines, right? And so if I were to do it based on my own skill, I was rocking it. I read the Bible every day. I was like super Pharisee number 1. You know what I'm saying? But my fruit was barren. And so the more I struggled to trust with God, the more I pushed them to trust with God. And the more that they got stuck, or the more that I felt stuck, the angrier I got at them for being stuck. And there were just these areas in my own life where I couldn't get past. And yet I would meet with them and be like, why can't you get past this? What is like, just do it. Just freaking follow Jesus. Okay? Like, it's not hard. And it was absolutely a mess. And I think that you want to know what happens when trauma intersects with a discipleship? It's a mess. It's messy. I'm a mess. You're a mess. Everyone is a mess. And the truth is, we're so afraid of our own mess that if I actually opened up my mess to you and really shared the depth of my fear and my insecurity and my despair and doubt and all of the stuff that I'm actually feeling, I am terrified you're going to completely reject me, right? And I'm not even just talking about being in the position of a disciple, talking about a disciple maker. I was not capable as a disciple maker of going to these people when they would tell me they were relapsing into addiction. I couldn't say, yeah, me too. I'm really struggling with this too. Because I felt like I had to have arrived in order to be speaking into their life, right? Like, I can't struggle. And I certainly can't allow I can't allow anyone to see my struggle. And so that's kind of the hard part about this, Brandon, is for genuine discipleship to take place, we have to be willing to be vulnerable. And as the one being discipled and as the disciple maker, we have to be willing to expose like the darkest parts of ourselves, the things in our past that we just try to run from. And really, we've just basically built our entire life around not dealing with.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think the discipleship process requires an immense amount of trust. And the hard part is that's one of the first things trauma robs us of, is our ability to trust. I couldn't trust the person I was discipling to not judge me. They couldn't trust that I wasn't going to judge them. And hey, I did. So I did judge them.
Right.
Right? And so then that just reinforces my fear. And so I think that's probably one of the most profound impacts on the discipleship process that trauma has. It's the inability to trust that, first of all, I'm capable and competent, that you won't completely reject me and abandon me once you figure out, like you said, I'm going to be the one person that totally derails you. And then trusting that God's actually good and that he cares and that he's for me. Trauma devastates that. And so what do you do when you go to discipleship where there is zero trust?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so just to summarize and recap here, you said 70% of our congregations are traumatized.
Yeah.
70% of our leaders have no idea how to deal with traumatized people or long-term trauma. When trauma meets discipleship, it's utterly messy.
Yes. Yes.
Neither you nor I have ever met anybody who has escaped the effects of trauma on some level. And we wonder why discipleship's not happening in the church. Exactly. Right. And I didn't even finish. And layer on the lack of trust, because trauma has affected our trust to such a degree where we either don't trust somebody else to handle our pain well, or we don't trust ourselves to handle somebody else's pain well.
Right. Like I don't trust myself to make the decision that going to church is good. What if I'm wrong? What if I can't? And so then you become paralyzed and you can't trust yourself to make even the most basic decision.
Right. Right. And the way we might overcome this. So lack of trust has undoubtedly hindered the discipleship process. I have only found my way into people's lives through trust. You know? I mean, it's not like you just walk up to some rando on the street, right? And I think the Gospels might present themselves that way. Like Jesus just found these two random guys on the beach, but I'm pretty sure they knew each other. You know, I mean, they're from the same town. It's a small town, right? I mean, you can go to a small town, you know people, right? I mean, so there was something that was built there, and so I've experienced the lack of trust on both sides. You know, where I may not be so trusting of how somebody's going to handle it, even the reaction, you know, to it, which I'm wanting a specific reaction, but knowing they may react another way, or others who don't trust me, you know, so much with their stuff. So we know that trust is huge as it relates to discipleship and how it impacts it. I mean, we could just pause and stop there.
Right.
With it, but what are some other ways? What's another way that trauma impacts the discipleship process?
So for me, so I'll be in the discipleship process with someone, and we start to open Pandora's box, right? We're starting to get to the root of why they're struggling. They're grappling with, oh crap, I have trauma. This is way bigger than me just wanting to have a dessert every night at midnight. You know, this is right. You know, this is way bigger than that. And then suddenly they're just too busy to meet. You know, they're overwhelmed with their schedule and they need to take a break. And I have encountered this so many times. And in fact, I have said this. I have given this excuse. On the flip side, when I had, you know, mentors and disciple makers in my life who would meet with me, I would just be like, I need to take a break. I'm busy. Right. And so what is interesting is the busyness is actually listed as one of the most given reasons with the church for why people say they can't be discipled. People say they're just too busy. And I know that you've definitely probably heard this expressed a lot. You probably get it a lot. And so, so here's what's fascinating, Brandon. So this guy named Thomas Huby, he is this trauma researcher and author. And he has found in his research that the nature of trauma is that we are always in a hurry. We're always in a hurry. So feeling the need to be busy all the time is actually a trauma response, and it is a fear-based distraction from what we would be forced to acknowledge if we actually slowed down. So busyness distracts us. It distracts us from acknowledging and addressing our own emotional needs, because that's hard. It's scary to sit with our own woundedness and like to have someone else take this flashlight and shine it into these dark places that we've kept hidden for so many years. And I mean, what is like the first thing that happens when you slow down? You slow down, everything's done. You've got all the lists checked off. You're just kind of like sitting there. You're not looking on your phone. You're not distracted. You're just sitting on the couch, breathing, doing nothing, having a moment. What's the first thing that happens?
Well, thoughts start popping into
Thoughts start popping into your head. Yeah, you are then, when you remove all the distractions, you become present. You start to think. Those thoughts bring feelings, and you start to feel. And the reality is, we don't want to feel. And so we fill our lives with distraction and chaos. And I do not say this in a judgmental way at all. I myself am prone to this. I think, to be honest, I think that we are a traumatized culture. Like, if you really look at this data that says that the nature of trauma is to be constantly busy, and you look at American culture and what it's like keystone, kind of what its foundation is to be successful, to be productive. And really ask the question, like, wow, does that mean then that our entire culture is just a trauma response? And like, what? And how big, how huge, like what does that even mean to be living in a culture that has to be numb all the time?
Well, and another way to say it is that our because we use addictions to numb ourselves,
Yes.
whether that be alcohol,
Yes.
porn, drugs, but busyness is also falls
An
into that same
addiction.
category.
Yes.
And some of the addiction recoveries that I've helped to with other people, there's chemical reactions that are happening in the brain, and usually one of the reasons we go to anger is because we're feeling fear and we don't want to feel fear, so we go to anger to override the fear.
Yes.
And so the same thing as it relates to being busy. Well, if I'm busy, then I'll have a stress response to that has releases cortisol and some anxiety, or some epinephrine. Is it epinephrine? Adrenaline. There it is. That's the one. And that help you feel differently than sitting with that. I mean, meditation has been the single key practice, if you will, that I have tried to institute with all those that I disciple, and it is the most rejected practice.
Yes. 100%. Even in my own life, I'm just like, oh, this whole meditation thing. Because you have to sit with yourself.
Yeah.
And we don't want to sit with ourselves and just be and just allow ourselves to feel what we're feeling. Because especially when you have experienced trauma, I mean, if there is this really real fear that you may just collapse under the weight of all of the things you have desperately tried to not feel. So we see busyness as a trauma response. And this is a hugely impacts discipleship.
Right. I mean, and again, discipleship's not about the do's. I think really, John Eldredge talks about discipleship being one of the streams of healing and restoration, right? That through discipleship, Jesus is teaching you how to live differently, to be able to rewire the brain, to be able to thank God for neuroplasticity.
Yes. Yes.
For those that don't know, that is just the reality that we can rewire later on. It gets harder, and the level of trauma, I think, makes it even more difficult, right? Yeah. But it's possible to rewire those things, and it takes effort and work and walking with Jesus. But discipleship is meant to be healing. It's not just a bunch of do's.
Absolutely.
With that. But we see lack of trust is getting in the way. We see busyness is getting in the way. I mean, I'm teaching pastors in Latin America how to build the culture of discipleship, and I have to pause the whole thing to go through time management exercise for a couple months because they just simply don't have any time.
Wow.
And
they don't have time to disciple.
Right.
I mean, it's not even their congregations that are saying they don't have time. It's these pastors. And that's so fascinating that you say that, Brandon, because my heart for this work originated in the nations. I rejected that I was going to be called to America until I was like in my late 20s. And God was like, Rachel, I have not called you to be a missionary. I have called you to America. And so really where I see this work as being crucially important is these cultures that are experiencing these traumatic events as an entire community. I mean, when you talk about, for example, South America with the cartel and all of the trauma that they have to live through, right, with and everything, like this fear for their lives around that. When you talk about going into Africa with not only the AIDS epidemic, but also these guerrilla warfare and having such instability in their governments, living in a war zone in the Middle East. I mean, these cultures are that, like, non-Western countries experience trauma on an everyday basis. They experience traumatic events daily, weekly, monthly. And so I really see that my passion to educate about trauma really began with how do we go to these pastors overseas and teach them about trauma and teach them, like, what do we do with these women who are systematically raped and they're coming to church and getting raped again, and they're coming to church and they're getting raped again. And these are the congregants that these pastors are having to pastor every single day.
Yeah.
And so in my mind, trauma is the number one. It is the barrier to discipleship. Hands down.
Yeah. So are there any other barriers? I mean, you said there were tons, but are there any others that you'd want to speak about? To discipleship? What's another one?
Well, I could go all day. But so the number one reason given across, I mean, the Barna Group did research on this, but there's been a lot of other research that's done on this as well. The number one reason why people give that they don't want to be discipled is indifference. So they just don't care enough to do it. And so really the way that this translates, and the way I've seen this be translated in the church, is they're too lazy. It's sort of this idea of laziness. They just don't care enough. And I believe that this is a deeply unfair assumption. So there's this term for what people with trauma experience when they feel they are asked to do something that they believe is beyond their capacity. And it is called hypoarousal. So it's this like freeze response. And what happens is you actually begin to shut down and sort of disengage or disassociate from life. And the other word that you use for this is indifference or apathy. And I can even actually use myself as an example in this. We were supposed to record this podcast last week, and you approached me to do this. And of course, my immediate thought is freak out. He wants me to come and do this podcast. And, I struggle with trusting myself that I'm capable, that I'm competent, that I can do it. And so the first mode that I go into is I don't have the capacity for that. I can't do that. And I'm spinning through all these reasons why, is that really what's important right now for me? And is that a priority? All of these things. I'm just grappling with all of this throughout this entire process. And so that entire week, I just didn't do anything. I didn't clean the house. I didn't do my laundry. I didn't do anything. And listen, I've been in this journey for 14 years of healing from my own trauma. And I had a trauma response because I felt like what you were asking of me, it was beyond my capacity. Was it? Clearly not, because I'm here doing it. But I believed it was beyond my capacity. Yeah. And so the Trauma Institute for Research, they say that apathy is a coping mechanism of those who have experienced trauma to protect themselves from further emotional pain. And so, like, in my own experience in discipling others and for myself, I don't think the dilemma of the person with trauma is that they don't want to be like Jesus, that they don't want to show up and do the podcast, that they're like, this is their passion. Right. That I don't think that's really the issue. And this is the belief of so many within the church. Like, oh, they just don't care. It's just laziness or whatever. And again, this is so unfair. I believe that the desire is there, but it's just so deeply buried beneath like fear and woundedness and despair. And so for the traumatized person, they have to learn really, they learn to make for themselves a life in the grave. And asking them to believe that there is more outside of the grave is inconceivable. They dare not hope that real healing and transformation is possible. And so when you come to them, Brandon, and you're like, discipleship, you can get healing, man. Like you were saying, like John Eldredge says, this is like an avenue for healing, discipleship. Like I can see you're struggling and you're wounded. Like, just come on, get on board. Like you can do this. And like, because the thought is, no, I'm beyond repair. And if you live your life believing you're beyond repair, that you're not competent, you're not capable, you are broken forever, why put forth any effort ever to do anything?
Right.
You know?
Right.
That makes sense.
It does. It does. I mean, and you think we've talked about the lack of trust, busyness, and now apathy, and the ways we may even approach that. I mean, I don't think that in general, I think there are some people and some churches that do really great at relationship, right? But the fact of trying to develop trust, it takes time, it takes vulnerability, it takes openness on both sides, right? And both you and I we're both private people. Yeah. So the reality of letting people in for that, it makes it tough. And so it's easier to just isolate or easier to put up those walls to keep people out. Busyness is championed in our culture. The pastor is usually most busy, yes. Right? And we love it, right?
He should be. I mean, he's getting paid, by golly.
Absolutely.
When most people don't realize that pastors don't get paid. At least pastors of small churches, which is a majority of America, we don't get paid anything.
That's it. I was talking to the guys down in Latin America. Some of them, their congregations got upset when they started asking for a Sabbath day. Wow. Got angry when they started asking for vacation time because they expected them to be available
all the time.
All the time, right? And so we champion, as a culture, and many cultures, it seems like. I was just thinking about the Chinese when you were talking about why are the Chinese so busy all the time, literally working, 70, 80 hours as a norm.
Yeah.
Well, it's a pretty traumatic place.
As a culture, they have experienced incredible trauma.
Right. And then now talking about apathy, just the indifference of most people, or feeling like they're just too far gone. And what kind of response do we have, for these? I know I've had to get over my own stuff with that. I'm just like, come on, just take a step.
Stop being lazy.
Stop,
Yeah.
And that's definitely not the way to approach, the situation. Yes. And even offering the gift, as you said, well, that's not possible for me, or I don't want to get my hopes up because if you crush them, this is a problem.
Right.
Yes. If Jesus doesn't come through on this, it's just better to.
So why hope?
Yeah. And so I think it sounds like dire straits here. Like we're just kind of fighting a losing battle, but I don't think that's the way you see it. No. I'm sure that's the way. I know that's not how Jesus sees it. So let's turn the corner a little bit and just talk about like what is the hope that you see in this? Yeah. Not only do you have the desire to train people to be trauma informed, but where's the good news? in this?
The good news is that we have a Savior healer. That I believe that when Jesus died on the cross, not only was that just an incredibly traumatic experience that he went through. I mean, a lot of people don't understand that what Jesus went through was so utterly demoralizing. Most of the process that entire time that he was being questioned and beaten and had to carry the cross, he was naked. And especially in that culture. I mean, imagine right now going into the Middle East and walking down the street naked, the shame. Now, today, imagine what it was back then. And that Jesus, his clothes were gambled away and they were stripped off of him. I mean, talk about a sexual assault. What he went through, catcalled and slapped and pinched, and it was this horribly demoralizing thing that he experienced. And so by the time that he got into the cross, he has already endured so much trauma, but then he actually, when he died, he actually took all of sin into his body, which doesn't just include my sin. I lied, and he took all of the sin committed against us. Every way in which I was sexually abused, he took into his own body. He took all of our pain that we have experienced into himself, and he experienced it fully. And then he died. And I think that what we don't realize when it comes to trauma is that not only did Jesus become victorious over sin and death, but he became victorious over trauma, like 100%. And so the work of the cross, the power of the cross means that anything that sin has done, anything that it has done to harm us, we are now able to be freed from. We are now able to be healed from and restored. And so I think that it is incredibly important to be talking about, to reframe the cross of Jesus and what the gospel means for the traumatized and the broken. Jesus came, he died, he conquered sin and death, and he went to heaven, and then he came back down, and when he came back down, on his body bore the marks of his trauma, of this traumatic experience that he experienced. And those marks represent your trauma, Brandon. They represent my trauma. They represent being beaten and assaulted and shot down. And all of these ways, like he bears, it was so important to him in his glorified body that he identify with us in our brokenness and woundedness, that in his glorified body, the nail-scarred hands will for eternity be nail-scarred. Like he deeply, deeply cares about us. And it's not just, oh, I care about you and this sucks for you and it'll be better when you get to heaven. It will be better when we get to heaven. But the reality is that the work of the cross means we can be whole and healed now in this life. There is hope. There is redemption. And let me tell you, Brandon, I am a living, breathing testament to what that looks like. Trauma wreaked havoc on my life for years. And it is miraculous what the Lord has done. It literally is a miracle. I am no longer the person that I was. God is even now rewiring my brain. Coming here today, doing this podcast, Last week, I believed that I was not competent. And something happened in a week for me to come into this space all week, to be praying about it, to be saying, Lord, like, I know that you've called me to this, but I don't feel qualified. And what if I mess up? And what if I can't do it? And Jesus just reassuring my heart, no, you've got this. You've got this. I've made you to do this. I built you for this, Rachel. And so now I'm coming in here today confident with my head held high. Something happened in that week.
Right.
He rewired my brain to believe that I can do this. So I'm living that healing out every day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even just what you're saying to me, it brings, Isaiah 52:53 to more life, as it talks about, he bore our burdens, like people are like, well, what is that? Your trauma.
Yes.
It's more than just the physical scars, but I mean, the trauma that you're talking about, the sins that are against us, his face was marred, beyond any human semblance, right? You talked about the personalities can change, because of the trauma. Well, Jesus was unrecognizable because of the sin, that was taken upon him, right? Yes. And then move to Isaiah 61, and when it talks about, like, I've come to restore the brokenhearted, right? To set the captives free. I mean, when you look at it through the lens of trauma, I mean, that restoring the brokenhearted is like a vase that's been shattered, right?
Yes.
Trauma that's happened that has literally devastated your heart. Jesus can put every single one of those pieces back together again. No one else can.
It's so true. It's so true, Brandon. And this is what's happening to me right now in this season that I'm in. Jesus is like blowing my mind, because what I am seeing in scripture, and I have never, ever seen it framed this way, and I believe this is going to be my life's work, is from the beginning to the end is the story of how Jesus heals, redeems, and restores the traumatized. When you think about these enslaved people who have experienced generational trauma, and the first thing that God does to show himself as Yahweh is to free them, and the journey that he takes with this traumatized people, it's unbelievable. And you see these themes of trauma all throughout the Bible. David is a person in the Bible we know more about him than we know about Jesus. There's more scripture specifically about the background and story in David than there is about Jesus. And realizing, wow, David was an incredibly traumatized human being. And we have literally the Psalms, his journal entries of what it looked like to heal from trauma. And so I'm seeing all of this for the first time. It's like, oh my goodness, the prophets, they're so traumatized. They're like talking about the trauma of this nation and how it's being lived out. And it's incredible to me. I have never heard or seen the Bible framed in this way. And so it started out as this process for me. I was saying, well, there's hope for me. There's hope for my little life, that Jesus can heal and restore me, because that's what he did on the cross. And then I started seeing, it's like starting expanding bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, I'm seeing throughout the entire Bible, I believe that the Bible was written for the traumatized. It is our story. It is humanity's story of redemption. I believe the story of redemption is the healing of trauma.
That's good.
Yeah.
Again, I hope more validation for those that are listening. But so Rachel, as we kind of move towards a conclusion here, what do you believe is the way forward for the church as it relates to creating a trauma-informed approach to discipleship? That's your passion. That's what you're wanting to really get behind.
So the first step is honestly acknowledging the prevalence and the impact of trauma within our congregations. 70% of at least are dealing with trauma on some level. That's 7 out of every 10 people. So if the church does not move forward in a trauma-informed way, if we do not reframe how we walk with people, how we disciple them, how we basically do every aspect of ministry within our church, if we do not reframe it through the lens of trauma, I honestly believe that the church is going to descend into obscurity, and we're going to become irrelevant in a deeply wounded world. And I think that that's where the church has been heading, into obscurity. Because if you ask the average person, is the church really meeting the needs of your everyday life? They'll be like, well, I go because it makes me feel better, but not really. And so the reality is we are living in a deeply traumatized culture, and that is built upon trauma responses, and I believe including the church. And so what that looks like is starting to talk about it, for leaders to become able and willing to be vulnerable, to start speaking about their stuff up in front of the congregation. If you go to a church and you're like, and you've been going to that church for years, and you're like, I don't know if anyone else here struggles with trauma, then odds are you don't have leaders that are leading out of vulnerability. You don't have people who are willing to be honest with what they're dealing with. And I do believe that the first step in healing is cultivating an environment of safety, a culture of safety. And so we have to start talking about trauma in general, what it is and how it impacts us. But even more personally, we have to begin to get up there and say, I've been traumatized. I'm struggling. Guess what? I just binged some ice cream last night. For all of you who are struggling, I'm in it with you. Let's heal together. There's hope for me. There's hope for you. And so I think being able to be willing to face our own stuff, and to not just have leaders that are like, oh yeah, I'm definitely cool with being trauma informed. I definitely want to walk with people who have experienced trauma. And I love that willingness. But what makes this hard is we have to be willing to face our own stuff.
Right.
So are we grappling as pastors and leaders and laypersons? Are we grappling with our own junk, with our own woundedness? And are we building cultures in our church that, again, are trauma responses? The constant busyness, the over scheduling, it's like we're doing all of these things, but are we actually producing fruit? Can we reevaluate from the bottom up? Are we being transformed into the image of Jesus? Is what our church is doing, are we being discipled, or are we just busy? So looking at our culture, really evaluating what's going on, fostering trust, supporting self-care. And one of the really big ones, and Brandon, I could just go on and on, but I think I will end with this one: beginning to address emotional and mental health in tandem with our spiritual health. We cannot be disciple makers who are only concerned with the spiritual disciplines, who are only concerned with, are you reading your Bible? Are you talking to God? We have to start asking people about their mental health, because these two things run parallel together. If you're not a spiritually mature person, odds are you're not emotionally healthy either, right? So these two grow together. And I think there's this tendency in the church to be like, feelings are bad. We don't talk about feelings here. We're just going to talk about the spiritual things, and our emotions, I believe, can be deeply spiritual. We experience God emotionally. To be in relationship is to be emotionally connected with another person.
Right.
And so if we're shutting off our emotions, we're not checking in. If the first question that you have when you meet with someone is, did you read your Bible this week? And not, hey, how's your heart? Like, how are you? What are you feeling right now? And really starting there. And I think there's a knee-jerk response can be like, well, that sounds more like counseling and not discipleship, and is it really counseling to just check in with people's hearts?
Right.
Can we be a people who love one another in spirit and truth, and who are honest, who are vulnerable, and who recognize that our emotional and mental health is core to what it means to be healthy, to be able to walk and do discipleship sustainably.
Yeah, I have some, thoughts on some of the things that you're sharing and just how you presented all that. To be very careful in how I word this, but for those leaders that are listening that don't take mental health seriously, I highly encourage you to reevaluate your position on that, especially after you've heard and you've listened today just about what trauma can do to rewiring the brain. I mean, God made such an intricate piece of machinery with that, but it's not shielded from getting hurt, right? If I can get a concussion from smacking my head against a concrete wall, then I can and that can change things, chemistry and all that. Then why can't I be changed by traumatic events? But, by traumatic events and other things that might cause, mental health. I have a dear friend who, the leadership over her are not taking her mental health seriously, and expecting that the spiritual discipline, well, then you must not be praying hard enough, or you're not reading your Bible enough. And they're not one-to-one, on that. And so but at the same time, I also want to say, I know you and our heart here is we're not out here to shame the leaders that are in charge of the church. I say this to the guys that I'm teaching how to, we've been trained in a different way. And unfortunately, we've been ignorant to a lot of, the deeper realities of things. And we're just going based off of what we know. And when we don't know anything different, we don't know to change it.
Right. We're learning. You don't know what you don't know.
Right. And so I hope people are hearing us that we're not trying to shame as we're talking about these things, but there does need to be a change. There needs to be a significant change. Otherwise, I think the church is going to struggle. Jesus will always have his remnant. That's just what happens in this. But I think we can head this off at the pass. And I want to encourage people. Again, discipleship's messy. We didn't even have to get into talking about trauma to know discipleship's messy. That's why people don't engage in it often. Apathy, lack of trust, busyness, things that you've mentioned. And so Kingdom Story is here to help encourage people. Rachel, you're here to help encourage people in this and to begin to start shifting into, if freedom is true, right? If people could experience what you and I have, how different, could this be? Like I said, I've known you for 8 years, and I knew what your life was like when we first met and you shared about stuff. And I went, you're still sitting before me right now, and all that happened. You have more license than anybody to give the middle finger to the world and do whatever you choose.
I have very many times, let me tell you.
And then to just see the development even over that time. I know whether you remember them or not, I think there were some places where you thought you'd come to a place of healing. And then realized, maybe not all the way.
Goodness, this belief that healing will eventually be over and I will have arrived and then I can just get on with the rest of my life. No. That arrival does not exist until we meet Jesus.
Until we arrive in glory, But I think pastors, I think leaders, this, if you go and examine the call that you had, this is at the heart of it. I think this is at the heart. You wanted to give people Jesus. You wanted to show them the truth of Isaiah 61, the realities of what they can be. And so we're in it together. We don't have all the answers. We're still trying to figure this out as we go. We're both still healing from our own mess. That's Jesus is still finding ways to minister to us, and we are in our own discipleship processes.
And yet he ministers through us. It's a miracle. I mean, How incredible is it that he can take us, these broken vessels, and bring life into others?
I mean, we hear that hurt people, but I think hurt people can also help.
Yes.
People.
Yes.
And that doesn't get said enough.
When did people can heal?
We can help others find the light. And as we, follow us, as we follow Jesus, in this. So Rachel, this has been an incredible conversation. I'm so thankful that God has worked in your heart to put you in that chair, today. I hope this is a beginning to the life's work that you want to commit yourself to. And I'm going to point back to this in 10 years and go, look what happened in these 10 years, after that. But, as we come to a conclusion with this, is there anything else you want to share with those that are listening today?
I think for those of you who are wounded healers, because I would venture a guess that most of us are. We've had our own stuff happen to us, and also feel greatly called to walk with others. I think don't ever stop. Don't ever stop. Don't ever stop pressing in to the woundedness. I think that I get to these places where I think, like you said, Brandon, oh man, I'm so healed. Booyah. I mean, there cannot be any more. And then God will reveal this whole new love layer. And I always have this choice. It's just so much easier to be like, I just don't want to. That apathy response is real, right? But to keep pressing into the cross of Christ, to know that whether you're at the beginning of that healing journey, in the middle, or maybe you feel like, you have to be nearing the end, right? Wherever you are on that journey of just being able to say and believe that Jesus is the one who is doing this work. He is the one that is healing you. He is after your heart. All he asks of any of us is to just be willing, to just show up, and he will literally do everything else. And I think that is what I love about discipleship. Just show up and let the Spirit move. And yes, it'll be messy. And you're not always going to say the right thing or do the right thing, and that's okay. There's grace. But to just keep walking the journey, I think is what I would say.
Yeah. Wow. Wise words from a wise woman. So you're welcome, Rachel. Well, so those of you that want to continue kind of on this journey, I will put in the description of this podcast a link to a YouTube video where Rachel does a presentation on all of what we talked about today, but it's an hour of her teaching specifically on this. You don't have to hear my boring voice. You can hear her beautiful voice as she's teaching about this. So the link will be provided there. You can also email Rachel at it's Rachel@newlife4s.com, but her name is spelled Rachael.
Thank you for remembering.
At newlife, the number 4s.com. If you go to newlife4s.com, the website, you can find her contact information there. She would love, to talk more deeply and to help just kind of inform your own staffs and those on the realities of trauma, and just to begin this particular work. I mean, it is absolutely needed. So Rachel, again, I thank you so much for being here today, talk about this. I thank God and Jesus for all the healing that he's done in both of us, to bring us to this point. And so we just bless those, that are listening to this. Remember, the trauma is real, that it's affecting everything that we do. And we need to be informed about it as we lead our churches in this new season. And so, yeah, everybody take care, and we'll see you next time.